Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. When I connected recently with John Linkous, he was the managing director of Fortaleza Solutions based out of Baltimore in the US. As we recorded this podcast, he told me that he was actually in the process of launching a new security business called Phalanx Security. In fact, the new business just launched this week, so this could even be the first media mention that he gets. Well, good luck with the new venture, John. John's focused on helping companies fight cybercrime. His team even calls themselves cybercrime fighters. So I called John to get an additional view on the Capital One hack mentioned in the podcast last week. As brands all seek to make their service more personal, we're seeing them ask customers for more and more data. But how safe is this? I asked John to comment on the Capital One issue, but also to think ahead and comment on how customer behavior might change if we cannot get on top of this data security problem. Okay, let's go straight to the interview. Okay, so recently Capital One in the US was in the news because of a hack that compromised personal data of over 100 million customers. And regardless of whether we see these events as hacks or just a mistake internally, how can companies lose this amount of customer data and then just say, sorry, folks, and move on the next day?
Yeah, well, that ability to defer accountability is getting harder and harder by the year due to increasing security and privacy regulations for those organizations. In the U.S., of course, that started with HIPAA almost 20 years ago. That begat the High-Tech Act, and there's increased penalties for data breaches here in the U.S. And of course, in the EU, there's the GDPR, and that affects U.S.-based offices and subsidiaries as well. For most organizations that are regulated, financial services, healthcare, there are already, even in the absence of federal level regulation here in the United States, there are at least state-level laws and in many cases industry-specific laws that require them at a minimum to disclose and will also sometimes have sanctions associated with them. So while there are certainly organizations that fall out of the scope of regulated industries where they can have a major data breach and in fact sometimes not even report it, in many cases and instances, there's not even a mandate to disclose that those breaches have occurred. For regulated industries, which are becoming more and more in quantity each year, there is a requirement to do that. Right. Another thing that I think helps us as consumers as well is that the media loves these types of stories. They, once there's a disclosure of a data breach, the media will echo that out, and so you have things like Capital One, and you had the Equifax breach here in the U.S. Earlier this year, which were just such major stories because there were so many data records that were compromised as part of it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, GDPR, you mentioned just there in Europe, one of the differences with that is that the companies need to explicitly tell customers why they're gathering the data and how it's going to be used. So do you think that there's any desire in the US to explore this kind of tougher regulation and actually, for companies to just tell customers what they're doing?
Yeah, I'd like to believe that, but unfortunately here in the U.S. we don't have a generalized data privacy standard at the federal level, and we don't have mandated security controls that enable privacy across the board, right? We have that hodgepodge of different rules that I mentioned earlier, things like PCI and HIPAA that are specific to types of data, or certain industries that are regulated. So you have NERC in the energy industry and Graham-Leach-Bliley for the banking industry, FERPA for educational institutions. We have pretty strong state-level privacy regs here, but they're really all over the place. For organizations that operate with, say, PII, personal identifiable information belonging to people from multiple states, that can be a little tricky for them because most states have regulations that apply to specific types of data or are applicable to specific industries. So, for example, New York has a regulation called RR 500 that applies specifically to financial institutions. But right now, even at the state level, only California, Maine, and Nevada have comprehensive across-the-board privacy laws. There's about a dozen other states that are considering them. They've been introduced, and they're at least at the committee phase, but they're not there yet. And then at the federal level, I think it's going to be tricky to deliver legislation that would supersede all those different state laws and provide the type of privacy rights that people are looking for, right? So I personally think a good federal approach would be one in which we start with two of the most basic concepts, and these are concepts that exist in GDPR, right? One is the right to know, which is the right to know who is using your data and how they're using it, and then number two, the right to opt out. If we could get those two basic things down, I think that would really help consumers to better understand how their data is being used out there, so that when there is a data breach, they can understand what the potential impact is. Then expand on that framework later on, where you're adding in things like age limits for opt-in, data portability, prohibiting discrimination based on your data. I don't think we'll ever get to the sort of the right to be forgotten level that the EU is trying to impose, but honestly, I don't think that's even feasible.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of critics even of the EU standard, even though it seems like the sort of international gold standard. People are saying that the industry moves faster than the regulators anyway.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Yeah, I mean, if we do see greater regulation, greater control, especially in the US, I suppose, around the way that the companies use data, won't that make the business models of all the major social networks and search engines almost impossible?
It will certainly require them to adapt to accommodate those privacy laws. I think what will need to change is first and foremost the level of transparency, because despite the fact that many social media networks say today that they're transparent, the reality is that they're far from it. I think one way that will affect those organizations is they're going to have to start offering more to users in order to entice them to opt in on the usage of their data. So essentially some type of revenue sharing model for their advertising dollars, although it may not necessarily be cash that's provided. So as an example, I could see Facebook partnering with major brands to provide Facebook users who opt in things like early access to new albums or concerts from major artists, or access to low-interest credit cards with their banking partners, things like that, if they agree to opt in and allow their data to be used. So I think, today it's pretty much a free-for-all where the social media networks can essentially, through their licensing agreements, which change on an almost constant basis, can do whatever they want with user data. But I think once we get a comprehensive privacy laws in place, particularly those that include right to know requirements and right to opt out requirements, they're going to have to fight and work a lot harder to get people to opt in. And I think people will. It all depends on what you're offering them and how valuable they consider their data. People like you and I may consider our data extremely valuable and not be all that concerned, but many other people might not. It all depends on what's being offered in return.
Yeah, that might all change as well if Libra ever becomes a reality.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah. I mean, I know that you're focused a lot on cybercrime. So what are the sort of problems your clients have been talking to you about recently? I mean, are they focusing on protecting data just because they feel it's their duty, or is it just because of the regulation? So people are focused on just doing the minimum required?
Yeah, certainly regulatory is having a big impact. Here in the States, California recently passed the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is clearly the most comprehensive state-level privacy requirement that's across the board. And so a lot of my clients are having, particularly the ones who have never been in a regulated industry before, are having a difficult time trying to understand and juggle what is required of them in order to comply with that state-level regulation. I think for clients of ours who are already regulated, and they're having an easier time, right? Because the idea of privacy of data is already bred into their culture, and typically they already have operational processes and tools to facilitate privacy. They may just need to tweak those a little bit. We are also seeing clients on the security side very interested in security technologies that enable privacy. So identity and access management, right? Things like, multi-factor authentication for applications, things like implementing a privileged access management, ensuring that they have appropriate auditing of access controls within their environment. Identity management is one of those key drivers that facilitates data privacy, and so we're seeing a lot of clients who are interested in enabling those technologies today.
Okay. And I mean, looking to the year ahead, there's a real strong focus on personalization today. You know, brands are collecting more and more data on customers, and this does improve the service because obviously, if they know more about you, they can recommend things better. They can give you better deals. You know, but how many breaches do we need to see before there's consumer pushback on this? I mean, when will we really start to see the public getting concerned?
Yeah, and honestly, I think a lot of the public is concerned today. The problem is they don't know what to do with that concern or that anger because, again, as you pointed out at the beginning of the podcast, a lot of organizations that have data breaches are doing, even if they are disclosing, it's sort of a hand washing and where they can legally do it and say, sorry, we'll try to not make sure that doesn't happen again. So I think for consumers, there's a lot of frustration out there. I think that what will eventually happen is it will get to a level where it's almost like the Kubler-Ross model, right? The 5 stages of grief, but on the vendor side, on the side of the organization that owns and manages the data. Today, we're seeing sort of that first stage, which is denial that there's an issue or that it applies to them. All of these vendors are looking at it as and communicating as, oh, this is an outlier. There's not an underlying problem with data privacy or security. But as people get angrier, they're going to go into the sort of the bargaining phase where they're trying to get it done as cheaply as possible. They'll probably hit the depression phase at some point at the confusion from all the multiple regulations, but eventually we'll get to the point of acceptance. And I think that's both on the consumer side and on the service provider side. The reality is that these privacy laws and security laws are not going away. They're getting stronger. They're getting more amplified. And at some point here in the United States, they will be federalized. And when that happens, that's the point at which I think the cacophony of anger that you're hearing from consumers today is going to hopefully be addressed through those regulations.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm at Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.